All right, let's get right into it. For forever, trial preparation has been all about instinct, right? Elite teams get together, they build a powerful story, and they walk out of that conference room feeling like they can't lose. But here's the thing. That feeling of clarity inside your own firm is not the same as clarity in the jury box. What we're talking about here is the leap from that gut feeling to a measurable, data-driven index for how ready you really are.
And this quote, this is the heart of the problem right here. Verdicts aren't decided based on how much you and your team believe in your case. No way. They're decided by 12 strangers who are trying to process a ton of information while they're under stress, feeling pressure from each other, and dealing with conflicting stories. That space, that gap between how you feel and how they decide, that's where all the risk is hiding.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. First, we'll talk about something called the consensus trap. Then, we'll look at why the old traditional tools have kind of hit a wall. After that, we'll get into a new way to understand jurors. Then model the actual chaos of deliberation. And finally, we'll pull it all together to redefine what real confidence in a case looks like.
Okay, let's start in what I think is the most dangerous place in trial prep. I call it the feel-good case. It's that case where everyone on the team is so aligned, so sure they're right, that it creates this massive, and I mean massive, strategic blind spot. See, this feel-good environment creates these mental traps. 3 of them are super predictable. First, you've got confirmation bias. You know how it is. We naturally gravitate to the facts that prove our theory. Then there's overconfidence bias. It's just a fact. Trial lawyers almost always overestimate their chances of winning. And finally, hierarchy bias. This one's huge. The junior associates, the ones who often think most like a juror, are they going to speak up and challenge a senior partner's idea? Probably not. So what you end up with is this very comfortable consensus that's completely disconnected from the reality of a jury box.
And this is where you can really see the disconnect. Over here, you have narrative comfort. It's the story that feels perfect inside your office. It's clean, it's powerful, it's a slam dunk. But then over here, you have behavioral measurement. This is the messy, complicated reality of how jurors actually decide things. They're building their own stories, filtering everything through their own life experiences, and getting swayed by the loudest person in the room. The chasm between these two worlds is where good cases go to die.
So if we know our own instinct can lead us astray, how do we test our case? Well, for decades, we've relied on the same old playbook. But those tools, they've hit a plateau. They just aren't sophisticated enough to handle the complexity of the cases we're trying today.
Let's just break down why these old methods are failing us. Static focus groups, for example. They're great for hearing what people say they think, but that tells you almost nothing about what they'll actually do when the pressure's on. Small mock juries? I mean, come on. The sample size is so tiny you can't draw any statistically reliable conclusions. And basing your strategy on simple demographics, well, that ignores the deeper cognitive wiring that actually drives decisions. You end up measuring surface-level opinions, not the dynamics of the decision itself.
This brings us to the solution. And, it's a pretty fundamental shift in thinking. We've got to move beyond just looking at simple demographics and start mapping the behavioral architecture of the jury pool. We have to stop just asking who our jurors are and start figuring out why they decide the way they do.
Look at it this way. Demographic data tells you the who, age, job, where they live. But psychographic data, that tells you the why. What are their core values? What are their attitudes about authority? So a 45-year-old engineer, that's a demographic profile. But is that engineer somebody who values rules and order above all else? Or are they driven by a deep sense of fairness and equity? Those are psychographics, and those are the things that actually predict how they'll vote.
Let's make this really concrete. Take just one cognitive trait, authority orientation. All this really measures is how skeptical or trusting a person is of institutions and experts. A juror with a high authority orientation is going to hear expert testimony and see corporate behavior completely differently than a juror with a low orientation. This one little trait is so much more predictive of how they'll lean than their job title will ever be.
But look, it's not enough to just understand each juror individually. The most overlooked and probably the most critical part of all this is what happens when you lock them all in a room together. To really know if your story works, you have to model the dynamics, the friction of the deliberation itself. You have to stress test your narrative.
A theme that sounds absolutely airtight in your opening statement can just completely fall apart under pressure. We call this persuasion decay. A juror buys into your story at first, but then what happens? Someone else in the room challenges it. Then they get buried in complex evidence and get confused. And all of a sudden, that narrative that was so strong starts to weaken and even collapse. What's incredible is that analytics can now simulate that entire process.
And the information you get from these simulations is an absolute game changer. This isn't just an opinion poll. This is actionable intelligence. You can see which of your themes are unstable. You can flag jurors with those deep-seated biases you'd never find in Voir Dire. You can even identify the personality types who are likely to dominate the entire deliberation. This isn't about what jurors think. It's about how they behave.
So all of this, it leads to a huge paradigm shift. It means moving away from relying on that subjective, gut-level confidence and moving toward a new standard, an objective, data-backed, index confidence.
This really changes the most basic question we ask in trial prep. We have to stop asking, do we feel good about this case? The new question has to be, what does the data signal? What are our risk clusters? How durable is our story? What's the probability we're going to hit resistance? The goal here isn't to replace your intuition. It's to calibrate it with hard data from that specific venue.
Let's be crystal clear about the value here. Prepping a case based on instinct makes you feel confident, and that feels good. But prepping a case based on measurement, that gives you control. Real control over your strategy, control over risk, and ultimately, a much greater degree of control over the outcome. It is the difference between hoping for the best and having a real strategic advantage.
So in the end, it all comes down to this: integrating two incredibly powerful forces. Your skill as a lawyer, your ability to craft a compelling story, that will always be the art. It's essential. But the science is the crucial other half. It's the rigorous process that finds the exact friction points, the exact moments where your brilliant story will crack under the immense pressure of deliberation. And knowing that before you ever set foot in that courtroom, well, that changes absolutely everything.